You're watching BBC News. I'm Yalda Hakim, broadcasting live from Lviv in western Ukraine. Russia's bombardment of Ukrainian cities continues. At least one resident of a block of flats in Kiev was killed when the building was shelled this morning. Several others were wounded. Overnight, the president of Ukraine said it was inevitable that a Russian missile will strike a member state of the NATO security alliance. His words came after 35 people were killed in an attack on a large military base near the Polish border yesterday. This attack is the most westerly so far. In his nightly video address, Mr. Zelensky renewed calls for NATO to close the airspace over Ukraine. Well, diplomatic efforts to end the fighting are underway again with a fourth round of talks. Mr. Zelensky said his delegation was trying to arrange direct talks between himself and Vladimir Putin, a meeting he said he was sure that people were waiting for. From Kiev, our correspondent James Waterhouse has this report.
These days, air raid sirens form part of the morning routine. Then, you're reminded why they're there. This 9-storey residential block was directly hit by a shell, killing at least one person.
We hid inside the closet. We thought we were going to be captured, that the Russians were getting in through the door, but we were wrong. We got out from the apartment and saw that the staircase was not there anymore. Everything was on fire.
It happened in the northwest of Kiev, where we're continuing to see the most intense fighting in the capital. That's not to mean the eastern flank of Kiev isn't avoiding shells either. This morning, an assessment of the damage. It's been a day of much heavier artillery fire, and we've seen a number of ground-to-air missiles launch into the sky. But even when these air defence systems work, they don't remove the danger. Debris fell from the sky here from an intercepted missile, say authorities, killing a person. This war is expanding within Ukraine, and it's now reaching the doorstep of the European Union and NATO. This missile strike on a military base in Yavoriv, which killed 35 people, was 15 miles from the Polish border. It's why President Zelensky is repeating his calls for the West to help police a no-fly zone in his country.
And now, I repeat again, if you do not close our sky, it's only a matter of time before Russian missiles fall on your territory, NATO territory, on the homes of citizens of NATO countries.
The fighting isn't letting up at all. This is Mariupol. It's been surrounded by Russian forces for 12 days. 12 days of being shelled. 12 days of little water, food or medicine for more than 400,000 people. At least 2,000 are known to have died. This woman was rescued after a hospital was shelled last week. Today we learnt she and her unborn baby later died. Not one attempt at a temporary ceasefire has succeeded here. Moscow's continually been accused of shelling agreed routes for people to escape and supplies to get in. There'll be another go today. Peace talks continue today too, and there are more positive sounds, with Ukraine claiming Russia has stopped using ultimatums.
Negotiations with the Russian delegation, round 4, will begin in just a few minutes. Our positions remain unchanged: peace, immediate ceasefire, withdrawal of all Russian troops, and only after that can we talk about neighbourly relations.
It doesn't mean expectations will suddenly rise. 19 days of a brutal war doesn't do wonders for optimism. James Waterhouse, BBC News in Kiev.
Well, Ukraine's President Zelensky has been posting regular video updates. Let's just take a listen to his latest address.
Wishing you good health, dear Ukrainians, good weather, which we hardly notice these days, clear sky. We don't have over Kiev and other cities of our states because of missile strikes. Streets are quiet, but I know and I hope that this is not forever. This is what we are fighting for, and we're not giving away what is ours. Today we celebrate our Ukrainian Day of Volunteers. This is the ability to get together and fight together, creating our own Ukrainian character. We may not notice each other in an everyday life. Let's agree we had this and it happened in our lives. But when we see threats to our way of life, to our spirits, when we see a threat to Ukraine, to our state, we're not hesitating, not a minute, because we're Ukrainians, we're getting united and doing everything to defend what is ours. We shouldn't be persuaded to become volunteers. Ukrainians don't need to be stimulated to start helping each other. Strong support of our armed forces by all people of Ukraine, sincere volunteer movement, solidarity of all our people. This is a precondition for our victory, for liberating of our country.
That was Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky speaking there. Well, we can talk now to our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, who joins us live now from Kiev. And Lise, we woke up this morning, much of the country was hearing those air raid sirens, frankly, right across the board. And what happened where you are is a block of flats was shelled. Just tell us a little bit more about that.
Yes, the air raid siren came a bit later this morning, Yalda, here, although I know in Lviv, where you are, Dmitro, where some of our colleagues are, the air raid siren not just sounded, but sounded for a very long time. But within a very short time here, we heard it again. And yes, just after first light, Russian shelling on a high-rise apartment block, causing one death, and the emergency services put out some images of the 9-story apartment block, smoke billowing from the apartments. It is sadly an image that we're seeing day in, day out, sometimes hour after hour in cities and towns across this country. This morning in Kiev has been turned into what many are describing as the noisiest morning in the last 19 days. A lot of Russian explosions from Russian fire. They're still on the outskirts of the city, but they're louder, suggesting heavier ordnance, and also suggesting that they're moving ever closer. And we know they are trying to push forward on the northwest and on the northeast. But we also know that the Ukrainians are firing back. So there was also a lot of surface-to-air missiles being fired by the Ukrainians. And that was the soundscape of this winter city this morning.
Yeah, Lise, we're just hearing there from Volodymyr Zelensky saying hello to his citizens, addressing them, talking about the blue skies. I mean, it's blue skies here in Lviv where we are. And it really does feel like suddenly the weather has changed, but frankly, the fate of the people hasn't changed. Just tell us about what's happening in Kiev in terms of, are people able to get out and about, or are most people still in their bunkers?
Well, the sun is out, but the temperatures are still low. It's still below zero or just above, as it has been for many days now. And of course, when you have bright skies, you can also get clearer intelligence of what is happening around this city. And whatever happens around this city, of course, creates a very ominous sense of foreboding to see the Russian armored convoys trying to get into the city. But with every day, the face of this city changes. It is a war city now, kitted out for the conflict, the shelling and possible sieges that are yet to come. I went around Yalda yesterday to a metro station, went to visit what's called a humanitarian hub, and the supplies are coming in train after train, bringing in the food supplies that this city will live off if indeed Russian forces move closer and try to lay siege to it. So we saw all the things that Ukrainian families live on day by day. We've seen pasta, tons and tons of potatoes, slavo, much loved by Ukrainian families, pork fat. And the member of the city council, who used to be an advisor to President Zelensky, told us that when it comes to a crisis like this, every Ukrainian knows what they have to do. Of course, many people have already fled, but those who are staying to fight in whatever way they can. Some of them are stocking potatoes, some of them are picking up a gun, and some of them are soldiers, and they're already fighting on the approaches to the city.
Lise, thank you so much. And as you say, the population of the capital has halved now, but people are doing what they can. Our chief international correspondent, Lise Doucet, there. Now, until this weekend, most of Russia's attacks had been targeted on the south and the east of the country. But yesterday's strike, just miles from the Polish border, suggested a change in strategy. Our defence correspondent, Jonathan Beale, has this analysis of the Russian advance.
It's day 19 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, and there are still signs of limited advances over the past 36 hours. Russian forces have been trying to tighten their stranglehold on key cities. They've been continuing their bombardment of Kharkiv in the northeast and Mariupol further south. The UK's Ministry of Defence also says Russian naval forces in the Black Sea have now established a blockade to cut Ukraine off from maritime trade. But the most significant development over the past 24 hours has been Russia stepping up its attacks on western Ukraine, including long-range strikes on a military base just 12 miles from the Polish border. These were the scenes after the strikes on Yavoriv, a military base which had been used by NATO to train Ukrainian forces before the invasion. Russia has said it will target the supply lines of weapons from Western nations coming across this border. One Ukrainian MP says it's an escalation that should worry NATO members.
The fact that this attack happened so close to the Polish border should be setting off alarm bells and red flags for all of the NATO member states. NATO cannot stand aside from this war, and that war is going to hit NATO one of these days very hard.
Taking the capital, Kyiv, remains a main objective for Russian forces. But again, they're making limited progress in the face of Ukrainian resistance. Russian forces have been reorganizing and regrouping outside the city, but there's also evidence that they may need reinforcements too. There are reports that Russia's looking to bring in troops from other parts of the country and even foreign fighters from Syria and Libya. US officials have also warned that Russia's asked China for military assistance, though Beijing has called that fake news. But it's clear that the early stages of this invasion has not gone according to plan for Russia. And they're looking at ways of gaining the upper hand, which could widen the conflict and impact nations beyond Ukraine's border.
That's our defence correspondent Jonathan Beale with that analysis on the Russian advance. Well, joining me now is Shashank Joshi, the defence editor at The Economist. Shashank, thank you very much for joining us. For the last 19 days, everyone has been trying to analyse this tactic, Russia's war tactic. Just give us your analysis. So far, it's clearly not going entirely according to plan.
No, it's not. The Russians have made advances. We must bear that in mind. They've advanced significantly in the south. And indeed, if their southern advance from Crimea is able to meet up with the northeastern advance, then there is still a risk that the Ukrainian forces in the east of the country, around the Donbass region, may be encircled and cut off completely. And they wouldn't be able to get west of the Dnieper River. And that would be a huge problem. So I don't want anyone to go away thinking that the Russians are losing and that the Ukrainians are on the cusp of victory. But having said that, it is absolutely clear that Russia's offensive on Kiev, the capital, and the center of gravity of this Russian military campaign is in trouble, that they have been forced to pause. They've had to regroup. They've had to find additional forces, including Syrian mercenaries, members of the Wagner Group, the mercenary company, Russian Chechen fighters. And that signifies, I think, that they're having real trouble around the suburbs of the capital city of Ukraine.
Shashank, just help us understand the size of the Russian military versus the Ukrainian. Just give us, our audiences, your analysis of the comparison between the two.
Well, the Russian armed forces are bigger overall, but the invasion force that they have deployed is somewhere in the region of 190,000 troops. Of course, not all of those troops are infantry fighters. Many of them will be logistics units, engineers, drivers, all of these other things that are vital for combat capabilities, but are not actually directly in combat themselves. The Ukrainian forces are slightly smaller than that, but if you count reserves, if you count territorial defense forces, if you count civilian volunteers, and Ukraine has had substantial numbers of those since the beginning of the conflict, the disparity is not that substantial. And I would also say that the numerical mismatch between Russian and Ukrainian forces is less pronounced than it might seem, because this is now turning into an urban campaign. Russia's most important military objectives are effectively cities, particularly Kiev. And, you know, the traditional ratio of attacking forces to defending forces, a very crude rule of thumb is that you need 3-to-1 superiority. But that's what used to be said a long time ago. In cities, Western military doctrine is that you need about 10 times the number of attackers per defending forces. So in other words, urban warfare is particularly manpower intensive, and the Russian advantage is therefore completely absorbed by the specific nature of the urban campaign in Ukraine.
So I think one of the things that many people have been asking is, why hasn't Russia got air superiority in this yet?
Well, we certainly expected them to. I certainly thought, I'm happy to admit, I thought they would have destroyed Ukrainian air defenses in the first 5 or 6 hours of this campaign, and it didn't prove to be so. And I think one reason is that Russia doesn't have particular experience in the way that the US and its European allies do of systematically destroying another country's air defense systems, a mission that we call suppression of enemy air defense, or SEAD. That may be because they didn't think they needed to, that they were arrogant. They thought they would quickly go in and topple the government in Kiev before they would need to establish air superiority. It may also be that they don't have sufficient precision-guided munitions of the kind that they would need, like anti-radiation missiles that can take out the radar systems of air defense systems. But what has become absolutely clear is that having failed to take those out in the beginning of the conflict, on day one of the conflict, they've paid a very heavy price. They have not been able to use their planes over Ukraine as freely as they would like. And just as importantly, Ukraine has been able to fly its drones, including its armed drones, over Russian columns, and has had considerable success in operating those drone strikes against Russian forces. Now, none of that would have happened if the Russians had successfully taken out those capabilities.
Air missiles.
And pardon me?
And surface-to-air missiles, because and surface-to-air missiles, because I think one of the things that, of course, we continue to hear here in Ukraine is, why won't the West impose a no-fly zone? And, of course, we understand this is a red line that NATO had always put in place, and based on Article 5, they had never had any kind of obligation to do that. But is it necessary? Is a no-fly zone really necessary if they have the right tools of trade, so to speak?
You're right. I mean, Ukraine's air defense systems, including both the little ones, the shoulder-fired Stinger missiles that have taken down a number of helicopters, and its bigger systems, the sort of the road mobile medium range systems like the Buk launcher, they've had considerable success. Now, their coverage is limited, right? They have lost some of those systems. They haven't got all of them in place, and they can only be in certain places at once. And if they are switched on too much, then Russian planes carrying anti-radiation missiles can see those air defense systems. They can see the radars on the ground and take them out. And I suspect what we will be seeing in the coming weeks is, I think we're already seeing it, is a debate in Washington and in European capitals over whether Ukraine might receive more of those advanced air defense systems, not just the Stingers, not just the shoulder-fired ones, but more advanced, bigger systems, perhaps Soviet-era systems in the arsenals of Eastern European countries. I think that's going to be the next big debate over what sort of arms Ukraine needs.
Shashank Joshi, thank you very much for joining us here on the program. That was Shashank Joshi, the defense editor at The Economist. Now, as the Russian attacks on Ukraine spread to the west of the country, the region of Ivano-Frankivsk, just to the south of where I am in Lviv, has come under heavy bombardment, with its airport reportedly being shelled 3 times over the course of the weekend. We can speak now to the region's governor, Svetlana Onychuk, who has a translator with her. Thank you very much, Svetlana, for joining us here on the program. I'm just going to explain to our audiences that you will be speaking in Ukrainian, and we do have a translator there for us, so we may have a bit of a delay. But if you could just help me understand the significance of where you are and why it continues to be targeted, because we've seen multiple targets in your region over the last 48 hours.
Росії і яка це ситуація. Яка цільова ситуація, так? Доброго дня. Я зараз на прямому включенні з Івано-Франківської області. Сьогодні Івано-Франківська область активно працює, приймає переселенців, людей, які приїжджають з тих областей, де проходять активно бойові дії. Ми створили координаційні центри по переселенню людей з тих справді небезпечних регіонів нашої держави. Відповідно, ми також працюємо.
Okay, I'm just live from the office, and we have created a lot of settlement centers for people who came from eastern part of Ukraine.
На сьогодні в нашій області вже офіційно розміщено більше 65 тисяч людей, які прибули в нашу область. Ми їм готуємо приміщення, створюємо умови для того, щоб вони почували себе як вдома. Дійсно, в людей велика біда, вони втратили свої домівки, вони втікали з своїх домівок, хто в чому був. Тому зараз для нас, для прикарпатців, можливість створити хороші, належні умови для цих людей. Ми приймаємо діточок з інтернатних закладів. Це люди з вразливих верств населення, діточки з інвалідністю, діточки колясочники. У нас тут працюють медичні служби, педіатри, волонтери, які дбають про цих дітей. Зараз це для нас є пріоритет допомогти людям, які приїхали до нас, переселенці.
So over 65,000 people from Eastern Ukraine came to Ivano-Frankivsk region, and we have created for them all the best conditions in order they feel safe. And also a lot of volunteers and also medical personnel are working right here in order to support these people. And a lot of
I'm just going to interrupt because I'm curious. I'm just curious to know, because of course there have been several airstrikes, definitely on the airport of Ivano-Frankivsk over the last 48 hours. We've seen several strikes. Can you please tell me why you think that you are being targeted, your region is being targeted?
Справді, із першого дня війни у нас були ракетні удари по аеропорту Івано-Франківському, також аеропорту у місті Коломия, нанесені удари, зруйнована інфраструктура нашого аеропорту. Відповідно, ворог цілився в наш аеропорт, і сьогодні інфраструктура повністю є аеропорту зруйнована. Звичайно, це був перший день, коли почалася війна, і пізніше також були далі ракетні удари по нашому аеропорту. Категорично на сьогоднішній день інфраструктуру повністю їм вдалося ворогу зруйнувати. Чому така ціль? Звісно, що на Західній Україні більше ворог цілиться аеропорти, аеродроми, хоча в інших областях Суми, Чернігів, Харків, Київ, там, як бачить весь світ, ворог цілиться і в пологові будинки, де знаходилися ні в чому не винні люди, діточки, і в мирні будинки. Тобто зараз передбачити, куди може наступна летіти ракета, дуже важко.
From the beginning of the war, there were several strikes in Ivano-Frankivsk region, especially in the airport and also in Kolomia. And all infrastructure right now are destroyed. And as we can say, we compare with Sumy, Kharkiv, Chernihiv, that there were buildings of people were destroyed, but in our region it was airport, and that's why it's like right now. So we have already 3 attacks on our airport.
Yes, that's what we've been reporting. I just want to thank you so much for joining us here on the program. That was the governor of Ivano-Frankivsk, Svetlana Onischuk, joining us there live from the region. And as we've been reporting, Russian attacks have spread to the west of the country, to this part of the country. Up until now, it really was immune to the bombardments that were taking place in the north, the east and the south of the country and in and around the capital, Kiev. But we have seen the airport of that region come under heavy bombardment, especially in the last 48 hours. Thank you very much to the governor of the region there for joining us. Now, several unnamed US officials have told multiple news outlets that since invading Ukraine, Russia has asked China for military equipment and aid. The Chinese embassy in the US said it wasn't aware of any such request. In a moment, we can speak to our correspondent Jenny Hill in Moscow. But first, let's go to our Barbara Plett-Usher, who joins us from Washington. And Barbara, this was really something that Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor, raised. He said that they had reports that China had been asked for this assistance.
There are reports quoting unidentified U.S. officials saying that that Russia had asked China for assistance, including military equipment. Also saying that Russians were running low on certain weapons, although they didn't say which weapons those were, or nor what exactly the Russians are supposed to have asked China for. As you mentioned, the Chinese have said that this is disinformation spread by the United States with malicious intent. The White House has focused more on the issue of potential financial support from China to Russia. Jake Sullivan has been very clear about that. He has said to China that there will be consequences if it tries to bail out Russia by helping it to evade sanctions. And that is certainly something that Mr. Sullivan has been raising with his Chinese counterpart, who he's meeting in Rome today, that and other issues, basically trying to see what limits China is willing to put on its support for Ukraine, because that is a big concern for the White House. Last week, U.S. intelligence officials said they believed there were limits as to how far China would go, but those weren't clear. They also assessed that the Chinese leadership was a bit unsettled by what was happening in Ukraine.
Barbara, tell us a little bit more about that meeting between Jake Sullivan and his counterpart in Rome. So that issue would have come up. Anything else related to Ukraine?
I think, Yelda, when it comes to Ukraine, and the Chinese have also said it would be a hot topic, the big question for the White House is to what degree will China go in showing support for Russia. They have also been accusing China, for example, of spreading disinformation that the White House believes could be used as a pretext by Russia to carry out biological and chemical weapons attacks and blame the U.S. and Ukraine for it. So that will certainly come up. But I think they will want to get an assessment of where China actually stands and how far it plans to go in supporting Russia. And certainly here in the United States, that's being watched by the intelligence community. It's also being watched by members of Congress who are 150, 200% on Ukraine's side. And we've just got word, Yelda, that the Ukrainian president Zelensky will be again addressing Congress directly on Wednesday. He did so recently and found a very receptive audience. After that address, the Congress approved nearly $14 billion in lethal and humanitarian aid. So that he is going to be speaking to them again about an update on the invasion, and will probably also be making more requests.
Barbara, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there. And of course, we will be following that address to the US Senate when it happens by Volodymyr Zelensky. Let's talk now to Jenny Hill, who joins us from Moscow. And Jenny, I wouldn't be surprised if this issue hasn't actually been raised in the media there in Moscow.
Not so much in the media, no. And the Kremlin have moved to dismiss this, saying that Russia most certainly hasn't asked China for military help, saying that this hasn't come from Washington but from Western newspapers. Impossible, of course, for us to verify. I suppose it is worth pointing out that Moscow is rather hoping that it will have Chinese support, particularly economically. Over the weekend, we heard from the finance minister here, who said that half of Russia's reserves have now been frozen due to sanctions. But he did also say that some of those reserves are in Chinese currency. So I think there is the hope that China might voice some support politically, economically, or perhaps otherwise. And of course, it has yet really to do so. Still rather sitting on the fence, I suppose you could put it. But yeah, as far as the reports this morning, the Kremlin is very clear. Absolutely not, they say.
Okay, Jenny, thank you so much for bringing us up to date there from Moscow. Well, I'm joined now by Victor Gao, who is Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization and worked closely with former Chinese leader Deng Xiaoping. Thank you very much, Mr. Gao, for joining us here on the program. I just want to get your response to this news that's come out in the last 24 hours, that the Russians have requested from China for military assistance. The Chinese have said this is disinformation. The Russians have said it is untrue. Do you know anything further?
I think this is untrue. Why? Because Russia has the most lethal and sophisticated military force in the world. And the fact that they are not using the most sophisticated weapons in Ukraine doesn't mean that they don't have that. And I think someone is trying to sow some discord between Russia and China, and also try to drag China into this very unfortunate war in Ukraine. China has good relations with Russia on the one hand, but also has very good relations with Ukraine. China has probably invested more than any other country in Ukraine. And there are lots of Ukrainian people in China working, living here. And this is a fact. China urges all parties to de-escalate, and China offers to do the mediation whenever all the parties, direct or indirect, to this military conflict agree to the fact that China wants to play a mediation role in the conflict.
So, Mr. Gao, does the Chinese Communist Party admit that this is an invasion, that this is a war, despite how Vladimir Putin is spinning this to the Russian people and how he is describing it to the rest of the world?
Well, personally, I have no problem of calling whatever that's happening in Ukraine as a war. No matter what name you put onto it, you see all the atrocities, all the deaths, etc. So we need to de-escalate whatever you call it by name. And at present, the most important thing is to de-escalate, is to save as many civilian lives as possible, rather than pouring more fuel onto the fire. Allow me to emphasize one point. I personally believe that mankind has never been as close to the brink of a nuclear holocaust as we are now. So no more provoking of the situation, no more pouring fuel onto the fire. We all should save humanity from a possible holocaust.
What is China and the Chinese leadership then doing to put that kind of pressure to ensure that we don't get to that point on Vladimir Putin?
I think you need all parties to tangle together rather than just call on one party to this war to cease fire, because Russia will not listen to that. Russia apparently has a job to do in Ukraine, and all the parties, Ukraine on the one hand, and all its NATO backers, the United States, all need to do the same thing. That is to de-escalate rather than continue to pour more fuels onto the fire, or urge the Ukrainian people, especially civilians, to die to the last man or lady. This is unfair to the Ukrainian people. We need to save as many lives in Ukraine as possible.
Well, from the Ukrainian perspective, they are being shelled and bombed. Residential areas are being targeted. And as far as they're concerned, and the way that this has appeared in the last 19 days, is that it is completely unprovoked.
Well, I think you need to read what a very distinguished American author who said that if you poke the polar bear in the eye, expect the polar bear to fight you back. This is exactly what's happening in Ukraine. It's very unfortunate. It's a great tragedy. We need to save as many lives as possible, of course, but don't provoke Russia expecting it not to fight back. And we are on the brink of a nuclear
Can I just
disaster.
briefly, I'm just short on time, Mr. Gao, but I just want to briefly ask you, do you think Xi Jinping is sitting now and looking at this situation and this crisis and rethinking the view on Taiwan and any moves that or any designs that China may have on retaking Taiwan?
The Taiwan situation is very different from the Ukrainian situation. Taiwan is the leftover issue from an unfinished civil war. In 1949, the nationalist government was defeated on China's mainland and fled to Taiwan and stayed there ever since. Taiwan is part of China. British government, the US government, all the international organizations acknowledge that fact. So let's avoid confusing the Taiwan situation, which is a Chinese domestic affair, with Ukraine, which is a separate country from Russia.
So if we were to look at the Taiwan issue, then would China put itself in a position going forward to move on Taiwan?
Well, one of the former leaders of Taiwan said ever since the early 1960s, China's mainland possessed sufficient military capacities to take over Taiwan by force. But mainland China has never done that. Why? Because we all prefer to achieve the unification by peaceful means. This is still the desire of the government here in China. This is the desire of the people on both sides of the Taiwan Strait. We need to avoid provoking the situation further, because if you push the situation beyond the point of no return, then you push for the resurrection of the unfinished civil war.
Okay, Victor Gao, thank you very much for joining us here again on the program. That was Victor Gao, Vice President of the Center for China and Globalization. Now, earlier I spoke to the Executive Director of the World Food Programme, David Beasley, who's in Lviv. Have a listen.
Well, you've got several million people that are leaving Ukraine, but they're being met at the borders by loved ones, friends, and strangers who are just taking them, giving them food, help. But what about the 40 million people that are still in Ukraine? They've got to get food. You've got besieged cities, you've got broken down supply chains. How do you get them bread? How do you get them the food to survive? Otherwise, you'll have 40 million people coming out. And that would be a worst case scenario. So those that are not in harm's way, how do we reach them? So we're setting up, as we speak, supply chain systems to bring in enough food to feed, for example, 2 to 3 million people. And that's not easy in a time of war. But 80% of our operations around the world are in war zones. We know how to do this, but we're scaling up because we don't bring in just food. We also bring in the supply chain systems for WHO, UNICEF, UNHCR, and other NGOs.
How do you get to a place like Mariupol, though, the besieged city? Frankly, because people aren't able to get in or out, and they're starving. There's no electricity, and there's no heating, no food, no water.
So what we do is identify as much as we possibly can, because it's always fluid. It changes by the hour, by the day, and we want to minimize putting our people in harm's way. But we're always looking for avenues to reach the people, whether it's in Mariupol or whether it's in Kiev or where it's Kharkiv, wherever it might be. So, for example, in Kiev right now, we've got about 500 metric tons of flour coming into the city, another 3,500 metric tons that will reach thousands upon thousands of people. Bakeries, we're setting up bakeries inside cities so that they can at least bake their food. We'll get the flour on the inside, however and whatever it takes to do that. And again, it changes by the day. But one of the things that's critical is setting up major distribution points all throughout the country of Ukraine, because this is not a small place. It's huge. And so we pre-positioning food, establishing major warehouses as we speak, so that we'll have the food position ready to move it according to the greatest needs, wherever the greatest harm may be for people that are in harm's way.
How challenging is that, given that women and children are fleeing, the men are being told they need to stay and fight? So getting people on the ground to assist you, truck drivers, for example, the farmers that are needed, as you say, for the harvest.
Wow, and this is a serious, serious issue, because the soldiers are on the front lines, and they're farmers and truck drivers and offloaders and uploaders for supplies and supply chain systems that normally exist on a commercial day-to-day basis here. So where are they now? They're fighting for their homeland. But we've got to have truck drivers and uploaders and offloaders. We need for the farmers to be back in the field so they can be planting and harvesting. Why? It just does not have an impact inside Ukraine. 30% of the world's supply of commodities like corn and wheat comes from Ukraine and Russia. 50% of our operations of food comes from inside Ukraine, and we feed 125 million people any given day, week, or month. We are already seeing price spiking for food, for fuel, shipping costs. In fact, we'll be feeding 4 million people less right now just because of increased costs. Ukraine commodities alone feed 400 million people around the world. So we can't afford for this supply chain system and the farming systems to shut down inside Ukraine. Otherwise, it won't just be Ukrainians that are going to be paying a major price. This is why we've got to stabilize and help the people in Ukraine, because it impacts the entire world.
I mean, given Ukraine is considered the breadbasket of Europe and as you say, 30% alongside Russia of commodities, if you can make a prediction 6 months from now, if this war rages on, how do things look?
Ukraine's the breadbasket of the world, and now we're handing out bread inside Ukraine. I never thought that would happen. If this war rages on for another 6 months, it's going to be catastrophic all over the world with supply chain disruption, increased food costs. But the poorest of the poor countries, you thought the Arab Spring was tough? We're seeing conditions much worse than the Arab Spring in 2012. And so destabilization of nations is going to take place. You're already beginning to see it in the Sahel region, like Burkina Faso, Mali, and Chad. This is only the tip of the iceberg. It's going to get a lot worse. When people don't have food, people riot. People go to war. And this is why the world needs to bring this war to an end and resolve it so the people of Ukraine can get back on with their lives, but also to understand this affects every human being on earth.
You were already overstretched. Yemen, Afghanistan, Ethiopia, as you say, Mali, Chad, now Ukraine. How much pressure does this put on your operation?
Just when you think it can't get worse, it does. I'm now cutting rations because of lack of money, not because of lack of food, but lack of money for places like in the Sahel and Niger and Mali and Burkina Faso and Chad. So what do you think is going to happen? You could potentially have mass migration into Europe.
And just finally, what would you ask from the international community right now?
First thing the international community needs to do is do everything they can to end this war. Number two, they need to give us the financial support we need to reach as many people as we possibly can, because if they don't, for every person we don't reach on the inside of Ukraine, there's going to be a person that leaves and goes to the outside of Ukraine. And that costs 10 to 100 times more. Give us the financial support we need now, because it's a lot cheaper to do it the right way in the front end than wait till it's too late.
That was David Beasley, the chief of the World Food Programme, speaking to me earlier here in Lviv. Well, I'm joined now by Angelina Karyakina, who is currently in Lviv but plans to go back to her hometown, Kiev, tomorrow. Thank you very much, Angelina, for joining us here on the programme. You are currently in Lviv, in the west of the country, but you plan on travelling back to the capital. It is a potentially very dangerous journey. Just tell me why you're going back.
Well, I'm stationed in Kiev. I live in Kiev, and I coordinate our news team, which also stays in Kiev, covering the war in the capital and around the city. So it's pretty much work and also my hometown. So I'm not planning on leaving it so far. It's just a short business trip, which I'm in. And it takes way more time to get from Kiev to Lviv. First of all, you have lots of traffic, people traveling from Kiev to Western Ukraine back and forth, but mostly, of course, westwards. Checkpoints around the whole country where the majority of transport is being checked, the IDs are being checked, the transport is being checked. So it takes a while now.
Yeah, are you not concerned about any kind of potential airstrikes?
Concerned every day as we talk. Actually, there's an air alert in Kiev taking off. Actually, this night in Lviv there was also an air alert. As you probably know, last night there was a massive attack in at least 35 people killed and more than 130 injured. So every night and every day there's it's not a potential threat. There's a threat. This morning, it bombarded as well.
Yeah,
Two densely
this
populated residential areas.
Sorry, go ahead.
Yes, as I said, two densely populated residential areas were bombarded. A Russian missile was shot down, and in one of the parts of the cities, in one of the areas in the building that was attacked, bombarded, over 63 people were evacuated from this building. It doesn't seem to be, a building anymore. I don't know where these people are living now, where they stay now, in these circumstances. There are not so many safe zones, not only in Kiev, but in Ukraine generally.
Yeah, you're right. I mean, last night it was 5 hours in the bunker. The night before that, it was 3 hours in the bunker. These air raid sirens are going off all over the country every single night as this assault on the country intensifies. But you actually got married 2 weeks ago in the middle of war and in the middle of martial law. Your husband now will be required to fight.
Well, he's not required to fight. He's a policeman, and it's his service. He's serving the country in this way, and he has hundreds of people in patrol police in Kiev to take care of, who are also servicing in their country. There's a lot of work to do in Kiev these days. The patrol police is patrolling and supplies. So basically, it was just a very short, celebration and a very short light moment that lit up, the day of us and our friends. Unfortunately, we didn't have so much time to celebrate, but we will win as soon as we win.
Yeah, and just very briefly, we only have 30 seconds left. If this war ends, what do you hope to do with your husband?
Well, we hope to build our life in Ukraine, to help recover the country. There are so many things that we need to do even now, helping, working, but there will be lots of work, except, of course, for the party which we plan to throw. An enormous party which we want to throw for our family and friends.
Okay, well, we really hope you get there and have that celebration. Angelina, thank you very much for joining us. Now, a group of Ukrainian children have arrived in the Thank you. A group of Ukrainian children have arrived in the UK for life-saving cancer treatment on the NHS. The Health Secretary Sajid Javid said the 21 children would be offered the best possible care in hospitals around the country. Well, we can speak now to Dr. Michael Groove-Saitlis from the University Hospital Southampton. He led the team that brought the children to the UK. Doctor, thank you very much for joining us here on the programme. I mean, we were seeing heartbreaking images over the last few weeks of children suffering from cancer in bunkers, running out of medication, running out of medical supplies. They've now luckily been taken out of the country and in the UK. Just tell us a little bit more about their treatment now.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me. That's exactly correct. These 21 children that we have brought across to the UK were exactly in those situations. These are children that do not deserve to have cancer, and certainly not deserve to have cancer treatments held back because of war. And so we flew them back to the UK for the NHS to provide our usual outstanding level of care to these children.
And how is that going? I mean, they went sort of a couple of weeks where it was looking quite dicey here in the country. Has that impacted their overall treatment?
So I think that it will depend on the cancer type, and that's definitely a question that the oncologists in the UK are looking at the moment. And certainly my responsibility was to make sure that these children were kept medically safe on the flight, because obviously these are children that have got life-threatening conditions, that have travelled through a war zone and are being put onto an aircraft to make quite a long journey. And so our team were responsible for making sure that their health and well-being were supported during that transfer to our oncology specialist colleagues here, who have now taken over the care of these children.
And Doctor, have they come with their parents? Have they been able to bring their families with them?
Yeah, so we removed the children with a parent and any siblings. So although we provided medical care to the 21 children on the flight, we obviously had the ability and did provide medical care to the fact that there was parents and siblings that had also travelled across a war zone.
How concerned are you? Because, of course, this is just 20 young lives that are potentially being saved. But how concerned are you about the many other children who are cancer patients still stuck in this country?
I'm concerned about all the children stuck in this country, whether they've got health problems or not. This is going to have not only physical impact on these children, it's going to have mental health impact on these children as well. And certainly, you know, moving children to the UK, it's not quite as easy as crossing a boundary of a country on a vehicle. We have to use flight, and therefore there is limitations in how many people you can move back in any one go. And so 21 is better than none, and I hope that the UK can support more children in the future, but that is definitely bigger than me.
Okay, Doctor, thank you very much for joining us and for bringing us up to date on those 21 children who have been rescued from Ukraine, taken to the UK, where they will get treatment for their cancer.
Thank you.
Now, from today, anyone in the UK wanting to open up their home to Ukrainian refugees can express an interest in the UK government's Homes for Ukraine scheme. This afternoon, the government will update MPs in Parliament about how it will work. Our political correspondent, Jonathan Blake, has more.
Hello, welcome. Let me show you around my home.
Opening their home to help. Christopher Marks and his partner Tracy are ready to offer room in their house in Bridlington in Yorkshire as part of the new scheme to house those fleeing the fighting in Ukraine.
I was homeless a long time ago. I've worked my way back into what we would call the system. Yeah, I have my own home. I'm very lucky. Yeah, I would like to make it possible for somebody else to be comfortable and safe. That's the main thing. They need to feel safe.
Since the Russian invasion, more than 2.5 million people have left Ukraine in search of safety. 4,000 visas have now been approved for those with family in the UK. But facing calls to go further, ministers say an unlimited number could come under the new scheme.
I think it is very valuable actually for a Ukrainian refugee arriving in the UK to have a British host that can help them in so many ways, not least with integrating into British life, especially after they've come from somewhere that is in such a traumatic state.
Under the scheme, Ukrainians will be able to stay in the UK for at least 3 years. Hosts will receive £350 a month as a thank you payment, and councils will get £10,500 worth of funding per refugee housed in their area. But there's concern about the level of support.
I'm full of admiration of all those Londoners and those across the country who have offered to provide a room in their home for those fleeing Ukraine. They will need support, not just financially, but the wraparound support required. And that's why we're asking the government not simply to speed up a really complex and cumbersome and clunky visa process, but also to provide the tangible assistance we will need.
Charities will play a crucial part in the process, matching offers of accommodation with those who want to come.
We're going to help connect people with people in Ukraine that need to come here. There's been such an incredible outpouring of generosity from our nation, and here's a really practical way that people can help, because without a sponsor, people can't come from Ukraine to the UK.
You're going to find some other buildings as well.
Protesters at a property in London believed to be owned by a Russian oligarch, sanctioned for links to Vladimir Putin. Ministers have considered seizing mansions like this to house refugees, but legally it's far easier said than done. Amid criticism from all sides of the government's response, many are eagerly awaiting details of exactly how the new scheme will work. Jonathan Blake, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, that's it for our special on Ukraine this hour. We will be back at the same time tomorrow. And of course, I'm continuing the coverage here from Western Ukraine and all the developments about the ongoing conflict in the rest of the country. In the meantime, you can get in touch with me on Twitter. I'm at BBC Yalda Hakim. But I'll be back with all the latest headlines in the next few minutes. See you shortly.